Some people spend their whole lives running from their past, their mistakes, their regrets. But what happens when life finally catches up? When the walls you built to protect yourself become the very thing that traps you? Victor Grayson was about to find out, the hard way. A ruthless billionaire on his deathbed rejects the only doctor who can save him. What happens next will haunt him forever. The city lights of Manhattan flickered like dying embers outside the towering glass windows of St. Augustine Medical Center. Inside the hushed, sterile walls of the hospital's VIP wing, the air was thick with tension. Victor Langston, a ruthless real estate mogul, was fighting the one battle his wealth couldn't win: his own mortality. He had built an empire on cold calculations and ruthless ambition, but now, as he lay drenched in sweat, gasping for breath, the fear in his eyes betrayed him. His body, once strong and commanding, had turned against him, and every erratic beep of the monitor beside him was a cruel reminder that his time was slipping away. Then the door swung open. A man in his early 40s strode in, exuding a quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with the chaos in Victor's mind. His presence was calm, assured. Dr. Nathaniel Carter. "Langston," he said, his voice smooth yet firm, scanning the vitals on the screen. "You're experiencing acute heart failure. We need to act immediately." But Victor wasn't listening. His sharp, tired eyes locked onto the doctor's face. Dr. Carter was black. A cold wave of prejudice, ingrained over decades, rose to the surface. Even now, even here on the edge of death, it ruled him. His breath came in ragged gasps, but still he managed to shake his head weakly. "No," he croaked. I want another doctor." A heavy silence fell over the room. The nurses exchanged glances, their faces a mix of unease and frustration. Dr. Carter didn't flinch. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last, but somehow it always cut just as deep. He exhaled slowly, then stepped back. "Mr. Langston," he said, his voice measured, unreadable, "I am the senior cardiologist on duty tonight. Your heart is failing. You don't have time for this." Victor's lips trembled, his pride and prejudice warring against the excruciating pain in his chest. And then it happened. A violent jolt tore through his body. His vision blurred, and a deafening ringing filled his ears. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was Dr. Carter's unwavering gaze. What happened next would change everything, forever. A billionaire's pride may cost him his life, until a shocking moment changes everything. The sterile walls of Blackwood Medical Center pulsed with an eerie stillness, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the hurried whispers of nurses. In the dim glow of the private suite, James Whitmore, real estate tycoon, billionaire, and known hardliner, lay drenched in sweat, his face twisted in pain. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, his pulse erratic, but despite the suffocating pressure in his chest, his jaw remained clenched in stubborn defiance. Fear flickered behind his piercing blue eyes, but pride still ruled him. He had spent a lifetime controlling everything: his wealth, his empire, his legacy. But now, as his body betrayed him, he found himself at the mercy of those he had always dismissed. A nurse dabbed the sweat from his forehead, glancing nervously at the monitor beside him. The numbers were dropping, fast. They were running out of time. The door swung open, and in walked Dr. Adrian Carter, tall, composed, and radiating an air of absolute command. He barely spared a glance at the billionaire before assessing the screen. His face betrayed no emotion, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, had seen this before. He had saved men like Whitmore before, and he had watched some of them die too. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, his tone even but firm, "you're experiencing a severe cardiac event. We need to act immediately before it's too late." But James barely heard the words. His focus was locked onto one thing: the doctor's skin. Dr. Carter was black. A slow-burning defiance ignited in the billionaire's eyes. Even through the crushing pain, even as every second pulled him closer to the abyss, his ingrained prejudice clung to him like a disease. He swallowed, his throat dry as sandpaper, before forcing out a whisper. No. The room went still. The nurses exchanged uneasy glances. Dr. Carter didn't flinch. This wasn't new to him. The names changed. The faces changed. But the ignorance, that stayed the same. Get someone else, James rasped, gripping the sheets as if they were the last thread tethering him to life. But no one moved. Doctor, Carter let out a slow breath, tapping a few keys on the monitor. He could walk away, let the man's own arrogance be his undoing. But that wasn't who he was. And as much as Whitmore didn't deserve his help, his oath outweighed his anger. You don't have time for this, doctor, Carter said, his voice quieter now, edged with something unreadable. Not anger, not pity, just truth. Your heart is failing. Right now, you're standing at the edge of a cliff, and I am the only one who can pull you back. James stared at him, his vision swimming. His fingers trembled as he clutched his chest. He could feel it now. The end. It was reaching for him, tightening its grip. His body was slipping away, the pain turning to a terrifying numbness. He was dying, and in that moment, staring into the unreadable eyes of the one man who could save him, he finally felt something stronger than pride, fear. His lips parted, but the darkness came faster than the words. And as the world around him collapsed into nothing, the last thing he saw was Dr. Carter's steady gaze. What happened next would change everything. A billionaire's arrogance could cost him his life, until an unexpected moment changes everything. The walls of St. Augustine's private hospital pulsed with tension, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and urgency. Samuel Hawthorne, a ruthless real estate mogul, lay motionless on the hospital bed, his skin pale, his breath shallow. Beads of sweat rolled down his temple, as his chest rose and fell in uneven, agonizing heaves. The world around him blurred, but one thing remained crystal clear. He was dying. The door swung open with a controlled urgency, and in walked Dr. Julian Carter, his expression unreadable, his movements precise. He had seen this before. The powerful, the untouchable, brought to their knees not by business rivals or lawsuits, but by their own fragile mortality. Samuel's glazed eyes flickered toward the doctor, and immediately, his breath caught for a different reason. The doctor was black. A lifetime of deep-seated prejudice clawed at his weakening consciousness, warring with the primal, undeniable fear of death. Even now, as his body betrayed him, his mind screamed in resistance. He gritted his teeth, forcing out words that were more air than sound. No, I want someone else. The room fell into a thick, suffocating silence. The nurses exchanged uneasy glances. The monitors beeped erratically, a cold reminder that time was slipping away. Dr. Carter remained still, his face impassive, but in his eyes, there was something sharper than anger. A quiet, immovable resolve. You don't have that luxury, Mr. Hawthorne, he said, his voice measured, steady. You're experiencing a severe myocardial infarction, a major heart attack. If we don't act now, you won't make it. Samuel clenched his fists, his pulse hammering against his weakening body. His pride was a fortress, a shield he had carried for decades. But now, as pain stabbed through his chest like a white-hot knife, that fortress was crumbling. His vision swam, the edges darkening. The nurses' voices became distant murmurs, drowned beneath the erratic symphony of his failing heart. The darkness came for him swiftly, and in that final moment when the void seemed inevitable, he saw the doctor's eyes one last time, not gloating, not judging, just steady, unshaken. The only thing standing between him and death. Samuel's lips trembled, his body sagged against the bed, surrendering to the truth. Do it, he whispered. Then the world turned black. He had built an empire, but in the end, trust was the only thing that could save him. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the first thing Samuel Hawthorne heard as he drifted back into consciousness. His eyelids felt heavy, as if weighed down by the remnants of pain and the sedatives coursing through his system. Slowly he blinked, adjusting to the sterile glow of the hospital room. The air smelled of antiseptic and something else, a second chance. His body ached, a dull soreness pressing against his ribs, but the crushing agony in his chest was gone. He was alive. The realization hit him like a slow-moving tide, pulling him under, filling him with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, relief, shame. His fingers twitched against the sheets, testing his strength, and then his gaze shifted. Near the window, seated with a tablet in hand, was Dr. Julian Carter. The doctor's expression was unreadable, his focus locked onto the screen as he reviewed Samuel's charts. But there was no tension in his posture, no edge of resentment. He was simply doing his job. Noticing the movement, Dr. Carter finally looked up, setting the tablet aside and standing. He approached the bed with the same composed efficiency Samuel had come to expect. "You're stable now," he said, his voice even but not devoid of warmth. "We successfully cleared the blockage and inserted a stent. If you follow the aftercare plan, you'll make a full recovery." Samuel swallowed, his throat dry. A full recovery. He had been teetering on the precipice of death, a heartbeat away from slipping into the void, and yet he was still here. The words sank in, carrying a weight that pressed against his already fragile state of mind. A silence stretched between them, thick and uneasy. Samuel's pride warred with his conscience, neither willing to yield. He had spent his life commanding boardrooms, winning battles with nothing but sheer force of will. But this was different. The battlefield wasn't a conference table, and no amount of power or wealth could change what had happened. Finally he forced himself to speak. His voice, though weak, carried the remnants of his once unshakable authority. "I suppose I should thank you." Dr. Carter tilted his head slightly, something flickering in his dark eyes. A trace of a smile ghosted across his lips, gone before Samuel could decide if it had truly been there. "You don't have to," he replied, his tone devoid of bitterness. "It's my job." But even as he said it, Samuel knew this had never been just a job. Dr. Carter hesitated, for only a moment before he pulled a chair closer, seating himself beside the bed. The shift in posture made the conversation feel different, more personal. "Mr. Hawthorne," the doctor began, his voice steady, "you came very close to losing your life today." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "I need you to understand that this isn't just about your heart. It's about your mindset." Dr. Carter's gaze didn't waver, piercing through the last remnants of Samuel's resistance. "Your prejudice nearly cost you your life tonight." The words landed like a blow, sharp and unavoidable. Prejudice, it had always been an abstract thing to him, something distant, something he had never needed to acknowledge. But now it was personal. Now it had nearly killed him. Dr. Carter exhaled slowly, his tone softening just a fraction. "I've been in this field for nearly 20 years. I've worked with people from every background imaginable, rich, poor, black, white. And do you know what I've learned?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter, but somehow even more powerful. "In moments like these, none of that matters. The only thing that matters is trust." Samuel swallowed hard, his throat tight. Trust, such a simple concept, yet it had eluded him for most of his life. He had built walls, fortifying his world against anything that didn't fit his carefully constructed ideals. He had controlled everything, except this. And now, sitting here in the quiet hum of the hospital room, the reality pressed down on him like an unbearable weight. Trust had saved him, not money, not power, not the walls he had built. Trust. He exhaled, the breath shaky, his pride a brittle thing in his chest. When he finally met Dr. Carter's gaze again, something in him had shifted. For the first time in his life, he was ready to listen. The weight of his own words hung in the air, heavier than the machines beeping softly in the background. For the first time in his life, Samuel Hawthorne was questioning everything. He had built an empire on certainty, on control. But now, lying in a hospital bed, his body still betraying him with every aching breath, those categories felt meaningless. Across from him, Dr. Carter sat unmoving, his expression unreadable, but not unkind. He had saved Samuel's life, not because of obligation, not because of wealth or status, but because that's what good doctors did. Samuel had almost died, and in that moment, in that terrible suffocating moment, none of the things he had built had mattered. Not the sprawling office towers, not the private jets, not the legacy he had spent decades crafting. All that mattered was trust. Why do you do it? Samuel's voice was raw, barely more than a whisper. His throat felt like sandpaper, and even speaking required effort. Why put up with people like me? Dr. Carter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied Samuel carefully, as if weighing his response. Then finally he leaned back slightly, his fingers steepling together. Because it's not about you, Mr. Hawthorne. The words cut through Samuel's chest like a scalpel, sharp and precise. It's about the people who come after you. The ones who will walk into this hospital years from now, with the same distrust, the same barriers in their mind. Dr. Carter's voice was steady, unwavering. If I can change even one person's perspective, if I can make them see the world differently, then it's worth it. Samuel exhaled slowly, a strange mix of emotions churning inside him. The words struck a chord he hadn't realized existed. He turned his gaze to the ceiling, the cold, sterile white offering no answers. Humility, regret, something close to shame. But beneath it all, buried deep under layers of hardened belief, there was something else, understanding. But understanding wasn't enough. Not yet. The hours dragged on, the mechanical hum of the machines the only companion to his thoughts. Sleep eluded him. Each time he closed his eyes, the memories of the past day replayed like a film on an endless loop. The pain, the panic, the suffocating weight of his own mortality pressing down on him. For the first time in decades, Samuel Hawthorne felt small, not insignificant, but vulnerable in a way that stripped away the carefully constructed armor he had spent a lifetime building. And that terrified him. The door creaked open. Samuel's pulse quickened instinctively, his body tensing, his mind so used to control, braced itself for what was coming. Another lecture, another reminder of how close he had come to death. But Dr. Carter surprised him. I wanted to check on you before my shift ends, the doctor said simply, stepping into the dimly lit room. He pulled up a chair, the quiet scrape of metal against tile breaking the silence. How are you feeling? Samuel hesitated. His fingers twitched against the thin hospital blanket, betraying his unease. Better, I guess, he admitted. Sore, but alive. Dr. Carter nodded. Alive is good. His voice held no trace of arrogance, no self-righteousness, just simple unshaken certainty. Sore means your body's healing. Samuel stared at him for a long moment before finally speaking again, this time quieter, more raw. I've been thinking about what you said. His throat tightened. He wasn't used to admitting these things, to admitting doubt. About trust. Dr. Carter didn't rush him. He merely tilted his head slightly, waiting. Samuel exhaled, his shoulders sinking into the mattress. I've always seen the world a certain way, built my life around those views, and maybe, just maybe, I've been wrong. The admission hung in the air like a fragile, untethered thing, raw and unpolished, but real. Dr. Carter leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. Change isn't easy, he said, his voice quiet but firm. It takes time, and sometimes, it takes something as drastic as a heart attack to start that process. He held Samuel's gaze. But what really matters is what you do next. Samuel didn't respond right away. He didn't know how to. For so long, he had measured his success by his ability to control everything. His business, his reputation, his world. But here in this hospital bed, stripped of power, stripped of illusion, he was faced with a truth he could no longer ignore. Control had never been real. Only trust had been. And for the first time in his life, Samuel Hawthorne was ready to learn what that meant. The realization settled over Damien Holt, like a slow-moving storm, pressing down on him with a weight he hadn't expected. He had spent years believing himself untouchable, above consequence, above change. Yet here he was, stripped of everything but the truth. Across the dimly lit hospital room, Dr. Calloway watched him, unreadable. There was no gloating, no righteousness, just a quiet patience, as if he had seen men like Damien before. And maybe he had. You've probably seen the worst of people, Damien murmured, his voice hoarse, the words tasting unfamiliar. It wasn't an accusation, not really, more like curiosity. Dr. Calloway's lips quirked into something resembling a smile, but his eyes carried a weariness that no amount of rest could erase. I've seen a lot, he admitted, but I've also seen the best of them. That's what keeps me going. A long silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Then unexpectedly, the doctor spoke again, not as a physician, but as a man. He told Damien about his childhood, about the small southern town where he had grown up, a place where hope was rationed, where expectations were set low and left there to rot. He spoke of his mother, a school teacher who had taught him the power of knowledge, and his father, a mechanic who had instilled in him the kind of perseverance that outlived failure. When I decided to go to medical school, Calloway said, his voice steady, there were people who doubted me, teachers, peers, even my own family. A faint knowing smile flickered across his face. But my parents, they believed, and sometimes, that's all it takes. One person who refuses to let you fail. Damien listened, something shifting inside him. He had spent years dismissing people like Calloway, men who fought battles he had never bothered to understand. And yet for the first time, he wasn't just hearing the doctor, he was seeing him. This wasn't about proving people wrong. It wasn't about pride or validation. It was about purpose. And suddenly Damien found himself wondering, had he ever truly made a difference? Or had he just moved through life, collecting victories that meant nothing in the end? Dr. Calloway stood, gathering his clipboard. You'll be discharged in a couple of days, he said, his voice even, but then just before turning to leave, he paused, his gaze sharp, deliberate. Take this as an opportunity, Mr. Holt. Second chances don't come often. The words struck Damien harder than they should have. He watched as the doctor disappeared into the hallway, leaving behind an emptiness he didn't quite understand. He wanted to say something, to apologize, to offer gratitude, to acknowledge the weight of what had just passed between them. But the words never came, because words were easy, actions were what mattered. For the first time in years, Damien sat alone, the sterile white walls closing in around him. The weight in his chest wasn't just from the surgery. It was something deeper, something closer to humility. And as he prepared to leave the hospital, one thing became painfully clear. Dr. Calloway hadn't just saved his life. He had shattered it. And now Damien had to decide what to do with the pieces. The weight of the discharge papers in Victor Grayson's hands felt heavier than it should have. Like a contract he wasn't sure he was ready to sign. A second chance. That's what they called it. But second chances didn't come without a price. The hospital room was silent, except for the rhythmic beeping of the machines, a reminder of how close he had come to the edge. He had spent his life building walls, forging alliances, crushing anyone who stood in his way. Yet here he was, stripped of control, saved by the very people he had spent years dismissing. Victor hesitated, then looked at the nurse. Before I leave, send in Dr. Carter. I need to speak with him. Minutes later the door opened, and Dr. Carter stepped in, calm, unreadable. He had been there when Victor's heart had nearly given out, had pulled him back from the brink. The man who had saved his life, Mr. Grayson, the doctor greeted, his voice measured. What can I do for you? Victor exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the pen. He wasn't used to this, owning his mistakes, admitting his flaws. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice rough, not just for how I acted, but for how I lived. Dr. Carter said nothing, just studied him with that same patient gaze. Victor swallowed. This wasn't easy. Nothing about this was easy. I've spent years convincing myself that power was all that mattered, that strength meant never bending, never trusting. But you, his throat tightened, and for the first time in decades, he felt something unfamiliar. Shame. You showed me something I was too blind to see. Dr. Carter tilted his head slightly. And what was that? Victor clenched his jaw. That the walls I built didn't protect me. They trapped me. And now, I don't know if I can tear them down. The doctor's expression softened, but his words were firm. Change isn't about tearing everything down. It's about knowing what's worth rebuilding. Victor sat with that thought for a long moment. Could he change, or was it too late? Dr. Carter finally rose, adjusting his coat. You'll be discharged in a few hours, he said, stepping toward the door. But before leaving, he paused. You have a choice, Mr. Grayson. Do something with this chance, or waste it. That's up to you. As the door clicked shut behind him, Victor exhaled, staring at the papers in his hand. He had spent a lifetime controlling everything, but maybe, just maybe, it was time to surrender to something bigger. Months later, the world saw a different Victor Grayson. A man who had once thrived on power and intimidation, now stood at a podium, addressing an audience, not with dominance, but with purpose. He had created something real, a foundation, a movement, a mission to help those who had once been invisible to him. The cameras flashed. The world listened, but Victor wasn't thinking about the spotlight anymore. He thought of the doctor who had saved his life, and the man he had finally chosen to become. Because second chances weren't given, they were earned.